All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise of Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise of Justice Movement and the Rise of Justice Movement, the podcast. All right. So, if I was to run for office, and I was just telling this candidate, which I'll bring in just one moment, but I was just telling him that if I was to run for office, it would be on this exact platform. And this is the first time I've ever said this on this podcast, but it's absolutely true because I believe in democracy. I believe in the people power. I believe in grassroots. And that's what this candidate series is all about. But without further ado, Matt, welcome to the podcast. This is going to be a good one.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive straight in. Tell us who you are, what's your story, and why you are running. I know this is a loaded question. There's a lot to this, but walk us through like just who you are, what's your story, and why you are running for Congress.
Sure. So I just top line husband, father, small business owner, and union member. I grew up in the district as a kid with my parents. My father was a engineer who had gone to West Point and served in the army, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom, and she was heavily involved in our education growing up. Team mom, PTA, all that sort of stuff. And then she got sick with cancer, ultimately passed away. Her mom stepped up to help raise us as my father was contemplating actually splitting up me and my three siblings, just thinking he didn't have the capacity to raise us on his own. So she kept us together and she slept on our couch 5 days a week. And then we would go to her house in Oakland on the weekends and then spend entire summers with her for a number of years until my father remarried and then the family moved to the Tri Valley, just outside the current boundaries of the district I'm running in. And for me, I very early on was always a very creative person. I loved to draw and write short stories as a kid, and that kind of naturally led into web development, graphic design as a teenager. I taught myself how to code when I was about 12 years old, back in the old GeoCities days. And I've been very fortunate that I have been able to merge that with another interest of mine, which is politics. And so, for almost 20 years now, I've worked in the kind of digital space. When you're the young guy on a campaign who happens to know things about computers, you kind of end up in that position. And so I worked my way into digital strategy, kind of everything from graphic design to writing emails to fundraising and just all the different kind of parts of a campaign that have grown in the digital space over the years. I worked at the DNC in 2008 under Governor Howard Dean to help elect Barack Obama. I was a digital consultant for a number of years for a couple different firms. And in addition to electing Democratic candidates, really kind of got my introduction to policy working on a lot of different legislative campaigns for labor unions on healthcare, the minimum wage, working conditions, with environmental groups on clean energy, clean water, clean air, climate change legislation, and then also with immigration activists. I worked with an organization that was instrumental behind getting DACA and DAPA implemented during the fight for comprehensive immigration reform in the Obama years. And over the course of my career, you start to you sit in a lot of policy meetings to kind of get an understanding of what the policy is from the real policy wonks, and then your job's to kind of make it palatable to internet audiences. And so, for me in this campaign, I make no bones that I'm not a policy wonk, but I'm very much someone who has thought a lot about these issues. And when you work in this space like I have, there's a lot to chew on, a lot to think about. And there's certainly times when you've worked with candidates who probably don't go as far as you would like to do, personally, but as a professional, you kind of have to suborn that in those situations. But now that I'm running for myself as my own candidate, it's been for me, the approach has been, let me put out there what I think needs to be done, and then let's figure out how do we make that possible. And so that's been a key focus of mine for this campaign. And the reason why I got into this race, a lot of different reasons. Principally, my kids. I have two sons. Both of them actually have autism, and they're 6 and 3 years old. And I think about their future, what kind of economic opportunities they have available to them, but also just the state of our democracy and the world in general. And right now, if we were to hand it off to them right now, I would feel like a failure as a father that I have not improved upon their current situation because right now, their future does not look as bright as, say, when I was their age. And that concerns me very greatly. And on top of that, my wife and I, we both have good paying jobs, but we rent because home ownership is, out of reach for us. Healthcare is another big issue for us because our insurance premiums doubled at the beginning of the year. And I would say that makes us one of the luckier ones. There's people out there who've seen theirs triple or quadruple. There's already like 1 million fewer people who signed up on the exchanges as a result of the expiration of the ACA enhanced subsidies. So they're going in without health care. And then, also with two kids, childcare is so expensive. We could never afford to send both of them at the same time. So we had to make a tough decision to send only one of them 3 days a week. And, if you look at any of the research on early childhood development, for every dollar invested, you see $4 to $6 returns through high school. Some studies even, suggest it's higher than that. And the thing on top of that too is once those early years are gone, there's no making up for it. There's no getting them back. So that's something that has concerned me a lot, not just for my own kids and missed opportunities for them, but kids all around the country. And my wife and I, we both work from home, so we've had the flexibility to send them part time and keep them home otherwise. And there's a lot of working folks out there who don't have that luxury. They have to be in an office, they have to be at the store during those set hours, and they have to figure out to make it work. And so, for me in this campaign, the biggest thing I have viewed it all as is basically, like in the richest nation on earth, life should be a lot easier than it is. And that's a really principal driving force behind my candidacy right now.
And it doesn't feel like we are living the American dream. Those of us who are working class, it doesn't feel like that. This is not an America that my grandfather grew up in. And he also served in the Air Force, and he was also a union organizer. So you and I have a lot of like similar backgrounds, and I love
Yeah.
that. Thinking about what's happening across the country, we see ICE and DHS running absolutely, that for lack of a better term, like batshit crazy across our country. We saw what happened in Minneapolis. We saw what happened with Keith Porter. We saw what happened with you know, literally everywhere in these concentration camps that are across the country. And I refer to them as that 'cause that's exactly what they are. Thinking about ICE and DHS, if you were born before 2003, I was born in 96. I am older than DHS. And we'll get into talking about, money and politics here in just a minute, but I want to kind of talk about like surveillance and like the militarization that we're seeing of police departments and ICE, DHS and Border Patrol. Um, what do you feel is currently happening with ICE and DHS? Because there's a big conversation around the funding of ICE,
Yeah, I
and
mean
just
they
thinking about that.
yeah, I mean they got a lot of money out of this Republican Congress at the
Mhm.
behest of the president last year. And the whole government shutdown recently was about specifically not giving them even more funding of their like baseline budget that they normally would receive annually. And I'm on record saying that ICE needs to be abolished. The way that not just that the behavior that we've seen with them, but also understanding that this administration has intentionally recruited ICE agents using explicitly white supremacist, white nationalist propaganda, using certain phrases in their social media posts, seeking recruits to ICE. There was an instance where they used an actual song that's very popular with white supremacists in their social media. And that's the kind of thing that there's no reforming that. You know, what I mean, that's a certain level of rot that cannot be excised. It has to be dismantled. Um, those functions need to be split up. The ICE is basically two separate functions. There's ERO, which is the enforcement officers, are the ones who usually are actually detaining people. And there's HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, which usually they're the ones who would be talking to folks in the community about specific threats within the community. And it's difficult to carry out that job when um, people are afraid of being detained and deported. People are not going to come forward, in situations where someone has committed a crime for that reason. And so it's just a situation that makes people unsafe in general. Um, and these functions existed, like you said, before 2003 in a separate iteration. INS originally was under DOJ before 9/11. And for me, I understand that there is a concern about people who are here that commit violent crimes. I don't think there's anyone who says um, you know, they should not be prosecuted, and if they're found to be here illegally, that they should be deported when they've committed a crime like that. But snatching grandmas and parents off the street, dragging them out of their cars in front of their kids and abandoning them, um, you know, that's not the worst of the worst that this administration claims. There was data that leaked at the end of last year that showed only 5% of all the folks that they had detained over the course of 2025 had a violent criminal conviction. And some 70 plus percent had no convictions, no cases pending against them. They were just low-hanging fruit that was easy for ICE to juice their numbers. So, that's a situation that I was glad that Democrats held the line on not giving ICE more funding, but they still have, over $100 billion. 30 billion of that is just in agent recruitment. So there's more work to be done. And that's not something that I think these next 2 years will be solved. But the way I've approached this campaign is basically there's a two-prong strategy here, right? There's the next 2 years with Trump in the White House still, potentially Republicans still holding the Senate. And so using a potential House majority to hold the line, protect people, protect communities that are under threat, use the power of the majority in terms of the oversight committee to have administration officials brought up to the Hill to answer questions, secure documents, get evidence. And also, I think in these next 2 years, working with um, state law enforcement authorities, like the Attorney General Office in California, in Illinois, in Minneapolis, to provide evidence so that they can prosecute these people at the state level until 2029, or in concurrence with the feds starting in 2029 when a hopefully Democratic president comes to power and is able to clean house at DOJ. And so that's kind of been my strategy on that in this campaign. And then just, you mentioned surveillance and kind of militarization in general. You know, there was a time when police used to look like actual police officers and not as Radley Balko, the author, had written many years ago, The Warrior Cop. And I understand that there are serious threats out there that require a SWAT-like response to situations. But this current iteration of how local law enforcement looks like they're about to invade Fallujah for every situation, it just creates distrust in the community. And I think it also sends a chill within the community as well that, in a sense, you're being occupied by military power. And so I think there's a lot of work that we need to do on that. Specifically, one of the principal things that I've outlined is ending the 1033 program, which allows local law enforcement to either purchase or obtain surplus Defense Department materials, whether it's weapons or armor or even MRAPs. Um, to end that program, there's a number of those what are called controlled vehicles that are still technically property of DoD. So DoD could requisition that. The tank looking like vehicles that you see on streets during police activity. And in my plan, I would send that to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian army for their own defense. It's I think weapons of war should be on the battlefield and not our streets.
Exactly. And yes, 100%. And let me ask you this too. You used to live in the Washington, D.C. area. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, you saw the headlines that National Guard is literally in DC nonstop. And they allege that, crime is off the rockers. I mean, it is, but it's a policy choice and it's a lack of leadership, right? And thinking about this, I sat down and talked with Alicia from ACLU of DC, and a really big topic is DC statehood because currently it doesn't have a US senator, it doesn't have any representation, but it has over 700,000 plus people that live in that area, which is more than the population of Vermont and Wyoming, as you outline on your website. But as a former resident of DC, what are your thoughts as far as National Guard? I haven't been to DC in a couple of years, ever since I went to the White House in 2022. But, thinking about this as a former resident, does this make DC safer? Or does it push us further into that militarization and the waste of resources?
Well, I mean, in talking with folks I know who still live in DC, the way they describe it is, a lot of the National Guard are just kind of loitering.
Mhm.
There was those images of National Guardsmen picking up trash in bright vests.
Mhm.
And so I think the bigger concern is more of just normalizing seeing armed soldiers
Mhm.
on the streets of the capital. When I lived there, I was there for a number of different inaugurations, 09, 13, and 17. And there would be National Guard everywhere. There would be roadblocks with Humvees, and even then, it was still kind of like a little off-putting to see that. And that would only happen for about the course of a week, maybe 10 days. So to have this be a prolonged experience, I think the fear, at least the fear that I have anyway, is that it becomes a normalized thing that people don't blanch at it anymore. And I think there's a lot of experiences that we can kind of call back to over the course of the last 10 years, where something that it was so out of left field and crazy 10 years ago is kind of part of our normal now. And that's a line that I think, you know, being desensitized to armed soldiers on the streets is a line that I'm really fearful about kind of crossing. Certainly with 2026, and who knows what this administration tries to do with a new Congress, or after 2028, whether we have a similar situation to January 6th or some other kind of effort by Republicans to thwart a Democrat taking power. I think that just adds another kind of mixture to the pot that we're not really fully prepared for, is my fear.
Mhm. Mhm. Exactly, 100%. And I think the preparation, yes, 100%. I want to go back just a little bit and talk about like ICE and DHS, specifically in your district. What are you seeing in your district, and how have you seen like the community respond to like ICE presence? I'm just thinking about this and just curious to see or to hear you share about what you're kind of seeing and what your constituents are seeing too.
Yeah, we haven't had the widespread
Hmm.
presence that we've seen in like LA or Minneapolis. And there have been some targeted detainments. There was the story of a woman and her two children who had fled her former partner in, I want to say it was like Colombia or Venezuela or somewhere in Latin America, South America, that he had been like a street gang murderer and she feared for their lives. And they had been here for a number of years. Um, and they were detained and deported, and her one of her sons didn't have his assisted hearing device with him, and they wouldn't allow family to deliver it to them. Um, so there's been kind of one-off stories like that we've heard. Um, and my fear has been, if there was a large presence, that this community is much more spread out than we've seen in some other cities with more densely populated areas. And I think what made resistance successful in places like Minneapolis is that there was a lot of people around. And out here, it's very suburban. And so people are much more spread out. And, you know, I think that kind of gives federal immigration enforcement a slight leg up. Their actions were thwarted because people can kind of come out in mass and oppose them, and they would just flee. And I think that the situation on here is a little bit more difficult to respond that way. There are support networks in the Bay Area in general and within the community specifically, where people are kind of coordinating with each other, but it's certainly a much more spread out area than just say like targeted neighborhoods within major cities. And so the biggest thing is just kind of making sure people understand their rights, make sure that allies understand what their rights are in terms of filming. We've seen a lot of federal officials, specifically agents on the ground, basically more or less breaking the law or telling observers that they can't do stuff that is actually legally protected. And so the biggest thing is for people to understand that they know what their rights are. And, obviously they don't put themselves at risk. They don't impede anything that would open them up to being detained themselves. But, information is, a huge part of that struggle, whether it's just understanding your rights, but also understanding if there's a raid happening somewhere, that the community can be alerted to that. But yeah, my biggest fear is a mass ICE presence in the area, uh, because I don't know specifically how just logistically the community would be able to handle that. And so that's something that if I'm elected, I would certainly make a huge priority, especially members of Congress. It's easy for a lot of different members to kind of be lost in the shuffle, but their offices have a platform, and especially local press will pay attention to them. National press will pay attention to them. And so I feel like as an elected official, I would have a responsibility to use that platform, physically be present as often as I can, um, and provide that kind of leadership for the community that they can count on me to be there when needed. And that's really foundational to also my political identity too, is that you know, I am personally not an immigrant. The immigrants in my family are several generations back, and they're actually the Italians and Irish, despite my last name. But at the same time, I feel a connection to immigrant communities, and I am very much of the belief that and it's kind of cliche to mention him, but Dr. King wrote about how we're all tied into a single garment of destiny, and that's very much how I view politics in general. That whether someone is LGBTQ plus, or an immigrant, or black, or anything else, that their future is tied to my future. Their standing in the community, their rights are tied to my standing and my rights. And so that's why I've always been heavily active in a lot of issues that wouldn't necessarily impact me directly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of LGBTQ, you would support the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act, which would label conversion therapy exactly what it is. Can you kind of talk about this for a second and think of and kind of walk people through that may not understand what conversion therapy is, and they may not realize that it's still legal in quite a few states. I say this as a survivor. I can share my experience, but it's a lot, and I've shared it before on very public platforms and news media. I was a part of a group that did a local ordinance here in Kansas City. But for those who may not know what the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act is and what it would do, and there's also the Youth Mental Health Protection Act, and there's a couple different ones like around this specifically. But let's talk about some LGBTQ things. Because there's also the Equality Act. So there's different acts that have yet to be passed by Congress that have been tossed around and talked about, and it has bipartisan support. But if you could just kind of talk about these the what you would support as enacting LGBTQ protections.
Absolutely. Well, specifically on the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act. So, what that would do is prohibit the commercial sexual orientation therapy as an actual I don't even I wouldn't even know specifically what the proper term for it would be other than torture, to be honest. But basically, the the quote unquote therapy that is meant to forcibly change lesbians and gay people into straight. And I remember um, the Daily Show mocking some of these Christian right folks behind these therapies. That must have been like 20 years ago now. And there's no scientific evidence for this. There's no need for it. It's literally, like I said, torture. It's forcibly putting someone through a program to change who they are. And that's really um, the baseline situation, right? I remember in the '04 campaign, the question was, is homosexuality innate or is it a choice? And I had thought we had moved on from that. This administration and the political movement behind it has certainly sought to take us back on a number of fronts, and this being one of them. But as someone who firmly believes that it's not a choice, certainly people come to that realization at different times in their lives, and that's fine. Certainly if they're in households where maybe that sort of orientation is suppressed or frowned upon, I can certainly understand why it would take a long time to kind of come to terms with that. But at the very core, for me, my attitude is always um, that we must support and defend vulnerable communities. And this is certainly one of those situations where, the LGBTQ plus community absolutely needs our support, and why I am very publicly in support of passing the Therapeutic Fraud Prevention Act. It's been introduced. I know it's been introduced back in 2021. It may have been introduced again since then, um, but it's one of a number of different um, uh, laws that I think ultimately would need to be uh, passed to protect the community. Obviously, these next 2 years would be very difficult to get Donald Trump to sign anything like that. So this is more of a longer term goal. But under hopefully a Democratic trifecta in 2029. But my attitude has always been, in the short term, pick up the legislative wins wherever we can get them, but laying the groundwork for sweeping change so that when 2029 comes, we know what we're going to do, we're ready to hit the ground running, and we don't waste any time.
Exactly, because time is literally of the essence, and these are things that should have already been done like years and years and years ago. And thank you for talking about that. Thank you for also having this a part of your platform. I don't see that very often. Like I said at the beginning, your platform is literally like a platform that's in my head. And these are the conversations that we need to be having. And these are things that people need to have on their platforms because it'll actually benefit everybody, not just LGBTQ people. The Equality Act obviously, enhances protections of LGBTQ people, but it also goes a little bit further than that because it prohibits discrimination and harassment, not only in the workplace, but schools, etc. And there was a lot of movement around this, and the momentum just kind of like died off a bit. Some of those incumbents were elected out, administration changes. So there's a lot that's kind of going on with this. Um, Thinking about AI. Okay, so we know the Pentagon is using AI, which is pure insanity to me. Um, we also see these AI data centers that are popping up across the country, and it's bringing a lot of real concerns. Uh, does your area have an AI data center, or has there been movement around it or conversation around it? And what has been that response been like in regards to these AI data centers?
Certainly, when talking to voters, I think um, the concerns certainly relate to its energy usage. Out here in California, we have PG&E, which notoriously is very expensive. We've always had really high energy bills for as long as I can remember. Um, and so that's always like a pressing concern. But also, the environmental costs, the water usage, water rights is another concern just in California in general. We spent a number of years in drought. Only recently has it kind of improved a little bit, but even recently the snowpack was not what we would have hoped. And so water usage is another concern. But then also, we've seen where these data centers have been built already, the impacts on local communities. There was one video where there was a very loud humming sound that could be heard in communities around a data center. Because you have to remember, the data center is basically a bunch of servers all running all at once, all night long. And so if you have like a computer tower like I do. I enjoy building custom PCs, and so my home computer is a custom PC I built. When it runs hard, it is very loud, and so you can imagine you have like several hundreds of those lined up all next to each other in a room, basically, at all running at all day, all times of all day, all during the day. Um, and there's communities I know in like Tennessee that are trying to fight it. I know in Maine, the legislature had passed a moratorium on it that was actually vetoed by the current governor. Um, and and I've seen stories about how already more than half the projects have been stopped by voters or ceased progress because of resistance. So the upside is resistance is not futile. There is a way to stop this. And I say this as someone who, I'm not 100% against AI in general. My background is a web developer. I've used AI to help me debug code or work with APIs that I'm not as well versed or familiar with. And that's been hugely helpful. But I certainly draw the line between using AI with like dedicated, you know, documentation or reference guides that have very black and white, here's how you do something, kind of instructions to them versus the more subjective and more reality distorting uses of AI. I think one of my biggest concerns was the way that Elon Musk Grok was basically turning Twitter into the single largest purveyor of child sex abuse material because they would just churn out CSAM, and Elon Musk wasn't doing anything about it. In fact, I think there was a report where he was well aware of what was going on and didn't care because it basically boosted profits. So there's a lot of work to be done on the AI front. Certainly the regulatory framework has not kept up with it. I've seen people out there who said that there's that are just not being enforced, but there's a lot of loopholes in how AI is used right now, specifically with regards to our data. We're seeing that with the federal government right now. The introduction of Palantir into the federal government. I believe they're, well into over $1 billion in government contracts, and what seems like illegally amassing data on Americans from a lot of different sources within the federal government, which um, um, there have been a number of protections set up to prevent that sort of data sharing, just because amalgamating everything together is a very potent weapon for the federal government, and the folks that are currently in charge right now are certainly not the kind of people I want with what is essentially a data nuclear weapon, because it gives them immense power of surveillance, immense power to go after people, whether it's on their financials, whether it's on any regulatory efforts that might impact them or their businesses. That's a grave concern, and it's certainly basically like a super weapon for an authoritarian leader. And so I think the Congress needs to assert itself on this issue specifically, and um, you know, provide some serious reform for the regulation of AI, because we're already at the point where a lot of these tools are kind of beyond control. A lot of people have access to AI, generative AI tools for images and things of that nature. And so my fear is that we're getting to a point where it's really just harm mitigation at this point. But if elected to Congress, that's certainly something that I would be focused on, because just the implications of its use are immense.
Think you were talking about Grok, and supposedly Elon has found some sense of. Well, I'm not going to say this because I'm going to be lying on my ass if I try to say this, but I was going to say he found like some kind of like sense of okay, maybe we do need to kind of like lessen the effect of Grok because at one point if you didn't pay for the subscription, you were able to access Grok, and you were talking about CSAM, and anybody was able to type in, like undress this person or undress this woman or, like these other like predatory things, right?
Yeah.
And supposedly it's been changed to where if you pay for the subscription, then you can use it. But those who do not pay for that subscription, you cannot use it. I haven't fact checked that. I haven't done it because I frankly wouldn't look at something like that necessarily, you know? But just thinking about like Palantir, has a really big influence and they had like a multi-billion dollar like market cap and there was a lot and we see a lot of conversation around Palantir. What are your thoughts around Palantir and how do we hold them like obviously accountable? Because it's not just Palantir, there's others as well. But let's kind of talk about Palantir for a second. And then I have one more question for you, and then we'll kind of like wrap up and how people can like contribute to your campaign and uplift the work that you were doing. But curious to know what your thoughts are around like Palantir and the influence in our elections and politics.
Yeah. I think part of this also too that is a particular concern is that um, the pay to play aspect of this as well. Peter Thiel, one of the founders of Palantir, is a huge Donald Trump booster. He basically
Mhm.
underwrote JD Vance's entire political career, and reports suggest that he was the one who um, helped convince Trump to bring JD Vance on the ticket. Um, and so that gives him a lot of power within the federal government, not just because he has contracts, but he has the ear of the vice president who basically believes he's a genius. And Peter Thiel especially has some very um, alarming views. He has described freedom and democracy as incompatible with each other. Um, the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, put out this really like almost explicitly fascistic manifesto recently that even has their own employees alarmed. And they're also part of a larger kind of techno-fascist movement in this country. Um, there's a number of tech titans who are really hopped up on this idea of the network state. The author Gil Duran has written very extensively about this, and I would certainly recommend anyone who's interested in this to look up his work. You know, Out here in California, they're seeking to build like their own communities that are essentially, in their hope, free of all U.S. law and basically run them as like fascist corporate dictatorships. Donald Trump had a plan in his 2024 platform that basically aligned with this view. He called them freedom cities or freedom zones. And if you're familiar at all with the Northern Marianas Islands and the loopholes on the labor laws down there, going back to this is in the aughts with Tom DeLay and that crowd, where they could mark their garments as made in America, but pay imported Chinese laborers basically pennies on the dollar. And there was all kinds of abuses tied to that. That's the kind of image that gets conjured up in my mind. But instead of it happening on a far-flung island somewhere, it would be happening on mainland United States, and basically neighbors to us. And so, like you said, there's a sprawling aspect to this. Palantir, like you said, is not the only um, um, company that's involved. There's Clearview AI, which does a lot of facial recognition work um, for specifically ICE. And so, for me, I'm a signatory to the Purge Palantir Pledge, in addition to not accepting any money from any of their executives, which, why would they give me any money? But, if they ever decided to, I would not accept it. But specifically trying to excise this cancer from the federal government, because I think, if we wait too long, it might be too late. The more they get intertwined in the inner workings of the federal government, the harder it will be to expel them. And so
Mhm.
that's something that I'm certainly raising on the campaign trail. And on some level, hearing about it even without prompting, I think a lot of people are really plugged in right now, and they kind of know Donald Trump's the most corrupt president in our history, and so that has sparked interest in the people who have access to him, and are basically within the billionaire class, the Epstein class, as John Ossoff has described, as long-term threats. Ideally, uh, Trump only has 2 more years left in government, and a lot of these problems are going to persist after him. And so, I think a lot of people are also looking to the post-Trump world specifically, and
Mhm.
this is a big one.
Absolutely. Matt, thank you so much for coming on this podcast and also, highlighting a lot of the key things that I really wanted to highlight. And you answered a lot of the questions that I was going to ask, which is really good. And I love that. I love whenever that happens because it makes my job a million times easier. But, with that being said, how can people contribute to your campaign and also, find you on social media and uplift, the work that you were doing? And as I tell all the candidates, campaign, your campaign website, your social media, etc., is going to be in the description of this episode. But, just for the audio, how can people uplift the work that you are doing and contribute to your campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. They can come to the website at mattortega.com. Like you said, I have a very extensive platform on the website. That was a very conscious decision on my end. I'm a web developer by trade. I've worked with a number of campaigns over the years, and it's always been my experience that candidates like to not put a lot of stuff on their website.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think principally they want the wiggle room to not be pinned down on any one thing, so that they can kind of dodge questions or perhaps
Mhm.
speak out of both sides of their mouths on an issue. I'm very much not like that. I'm way too opinionated to do that. And so, for me, when I look at some of the other candidates running in my race who maybe just have some lip service to a particular issue, I wanted to give a very thorough kind of here's what I see the problem is, and here's what I think needs to be done about it. And a lot of these issues are things that I've worked on either professionally or as an activist over the years. And so, like I said, I've given them a lot of thought. And so I really hope people go to my website, mattertaker.com, check out my agenda. It's a constantly evolving agenda, consistently adding new things there as I have time, as I write these myself. Um, and I encourage people to reach out, whether it's through the website or on social media, which are all linked from the website. Um, you know, I certainly welcome people reaching out and asking questions, whether it's through email or on social media. I'm a very open book. One of the things that I heard on the campaign trail from voters is they felt that Eric Swalwell, who was the preceding member of Congress that held this seat until recently, was that they didn't see him very often. They didn't hear from him very often. Certainly, he would be on national cable news programs, but I want to be as accessible as I can. I don't know if that's because I worked in retail for a number of years as a young man, but I very much enjoy hearing from people, and even if we don't agree on the issues, I respect other people's views, and I'm happy to have a back and forth on why I believe a certain thing or a certain policy. But you know, um, yeah, definitely encourage people to reach out, uh, donate if they can. Every dollar helps. I'm in a campaign against eight other candidates, including one who's self-funded over $1 million in their campaign. And I'm decidedly not running a campaign like that. So um, all the help I can get is hugely important. And despite their war chest, I'm running even with them in the polling. And the other thing I would just mention is, California has top two primaries. So um, any two candidates, regardless of party, end up on the general election ballot in November. And so what I've been trying to tell people is, the primary vote is not about who you think needs to be the next member of Congress per se, but it's about what do you want that 5 months of debate to be. I'm up against a sitting state senator, a former mayor, a city council member, a wealthy lawyer, and a number of other candidates. And I think, a race where I believe one of the elected officials is likely to be in the top spot. And so that second spot is all about what do you want that debate to be? And I've been suggesting to people that having an activist with a national political background on that debate stage in the fall presents a unique opportunity to discuss the future of the Democratic Party, what kind of party we want to be, but also what kind of agenda we need to set, not just for the next 2 years, but to rebuild everything that Donald Trump has destroyed. And I think for my view, there's no normal to go back to. It's we need an entirely new way of approaching our politics at the federal level. And that, for me, includes taxing the wealthy to provide social services to working people. And like I said, to make life a little bit easier for all of us. And so that's my message in this campaign. And I hope people go to mattortega.com and decide to support me.
Absolutely. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I look forward to seeing the results of this primary. And please take care of yourself out there and make sure you stay hydrated too.
Will do.
I just had to add that little part in there because I know it's something that a lot of candidates forget about. And, hospitals are expensive, it's just,
Yeah.
it all trickles down, right? And it all comes down to the working class. But again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and please take care of yourself, okay?
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.